Hi, my name is Brianna Van Dyke, and I'm a graduate student at Morningside College, and I'm also an instructional coach at Ames Middle School. The title of my research is Reading Intervention Instruction that Promotes a Positive Reading Identity. When we consider the problem in the United States, students both locally and nationally are reading below the proficiency levels, and the current interventions are not closing those gaps quickly enough. We have deficit models in our schools. When we think of multi-tiered systems of support, students take a universal screener at the start of the year, and they are identified by their deficits, and then they receive individualized education or interventions according to what they need. This has a negative impact on student self-perception. Hall has done a lot of research around reading identity and the impact in the classroom, and she states that reading identity is both the student's self-perception of them being able to comprehend a text and apply reading strategies, as well as the value that they place on reading. Teachers are differentiating, and yet students go through school with low efficacy, which impacts their ability to perform well in the classroom and have the skills necessary for both college or career. I'm motivated by this particular topic because change theory is interesting to me. I had done a lot of research around change theory as a leader in the building, and I just was curious as to how that change theory could also apply to kids. And just with the deficit model of MTSS, I wanted to identify some interventions where we were able to get to know the student behind the numbers and possibly intervene at that level. As we review the literature, we'll look at Robert Dilts' nested levels of change. We'll look at how other researchers have intervened at the identity level, and we'll take a look at the research around goal setting and reflection. Robert Dilts' nested levels of change incorporate these 5 pillars. He says that in order to impact, that we need to intervene at the level below. So in our case, we wanted to impact students' behaviors and capabilities with regards to reading. And he says that it's important that we look at their beliefs and values as well as their identity. Other researchers who have conducted studies around intervening at the identity level have identified that students actually don't apply reading strategies that are taught from even the most skilled of teachers if they have that poor identity as a reader. It's important that we provide choice and metacognition in order to increase the student's identity as a reader. With regards to goal setting and reflection, there was a study conducted where students were split into 2 groups. One group received performance feedback and they set their own goals, and this resulted in greater academic growth than the group who received neither performance feedback nor goal setting. The social cognitive theory by Albert Bandura focuses on self-efficacy, and he says in order to impact or raise up someone's self-efficacy, that they need to experience these 4 things. They need to understand how to persevere through failure. They need to see others succeed around them. They need to have positive peer pressure, and they need to have an increase in positive responses to a task. And so he also talks about how setting goals is imperative for self-regulation, and this contributes to their cognitive motivation as well. So this is the theory that this study was based upon. There are still gaps in research as always, and couple of the gaps that I identified was a lack of quantitative data. A lot of the studies focused on student questionnaires and interviews, and there was a lack of quantitative data around the studying of impacting a student's reading identity. Also, specific interventions. We know that metacognition was important, and we know that allowing students time for reflection was important, but no other interventions were provided in the research. And so in order to fill that research, goal setting would possibly be a way to do so. The purpose of this study is really to understand how student achievement could be impacted by focusing on developing a positive identity as a reader. You can see here that the hypothesis is that if partially proficient students set their own reading goals, then their value of reading would increase according to the motivation to read profile, and achievement as measured by the grade would also increase. The methods for this particular reading identity study, you can see the participant demographics here. 4 6th grade students, 2 males and 2 females, participated in the study. As you compare the demographic makeup of the intervention as to the ethnic demographics of the building, you can see that this was quite a diverse group. The total district enrollment is just over 4,500, and the middle school makes up about a quarter of that. As far as selection goes, these students had already been identified according to our multi-tier systems of support for a need for a reading intervention. They, in the fall, were reading between a 3.8 and a 4.6 grade equivalent, so you can see that they were discrepant from their peers. Those students were already receiving an intervention first semester, and when the study started in January, they continued to receive the same intervention. Materials, one of the materials was the reading identity lesson sequence. You can see here that the outcomes for each of those lessons are listed. In lesson 1, we really tried to get at understanding their personal identity as a reader. We created timelines and we looked back at reading and their relationship with reading over the course of time. We also defined what a reader was. I wanted them to think about a reader in a broader sense, not just someone who reads fiction books, but someone who consumes information, and so from a variety of sources. And so I wanted them to be able to see themselves as a reader as we defined what a reader was. The outcomes for lesson 2, you can see that students reflected on their current reading life, so bringing in some of that metacognition from their literature review. Students defined then what their desired reading identity was, and we used this to set long-term reading goals. We used a graphic organizer for the weekly goal setting periods, and the goals were based on the students' desire for a positive reading identity. Cognitive coaching, planning, and reflecting maps were also used in the study. The planning maps were used at the start of the goal setting period, and the reflecting maps were used at the conclusion of the goal setting period. The planning map, you can see, really just asks the student to clarify goals, and so the researcher used this map to talk the students through what they wanted their goal to be for that period of time. It also asked them to think of success indicators. So what would they see, feel, be able to do if they met that particular goal? It asked them to think through strategies and possibly roadblocks that could come up. And then the reflecting map that was used by the research at the end of the study included allowing the students to kind of summarize their impressions of their week and how they did with their goal, to analyze those causal factors with regards to what were some of the things that came up, the roadblocks, and how did you get past them in order to meet, or maybe they didn't meet their goal. What were the reasons why? Other materials used in this study were the motivation to read profile, which is just a way to quantify student self-perception as well as their value of reading. And so students were asked questions, and the data could be coded according to self-perception or value, and then equated into a total score. And so the group reading and diagnostic assessment measured their comprehension. It's a universal screener that the district uses in the fall, in the winter, and then again in the spring to check students' progress on their comprehension. This was an ABAB study design. The A phases included no goal setting, and the B phases included weekly goal setting with the planning and reflecting conversations with the researcher at the start and at the end of that goal setting period. Data analysis, you can see a pair sample t-test was used for comparing the data from the pre-assessment and the post-assessment of the grade. Again, that was measuring reading comprehension. And then a paired sample t-test was used for the coded data on the motivation to read profile, and students took that 4 times over the course of the study to be able to compare the baseline and the treatment phases each time. The alpha level was set at 0.05. As we take a look at some of the results here, you can see that that the treatment 1 mean score was 3.5 points higher than that of the baseline mean score. And for that particular period of time, the p-value was 0.13. You can also see that the treatment 2 mean score is 2.7 points higher than that of the baseline 2 mean score, and the p-value was 0.446. Here are the results of the grade assessment on the pre-assessment and the post-assessment. The mean score of the post-assessment was 8 points higher than that of the pre-assessment. So when we think about whether or not the hypothesis was statistically significant, we can see that setting weekly goals would increase a student's reading identity according to the motivation to read profile. That was found to be statistically significant, and that setting goals did not result in a statistically significant increase of scores on the grade assessment. So how did my study mesh with other studies? It meshed well with the reading identity review that we did of the literature review. When we think about self-perception and value, we think about explicitly teaching and reflecting around shaping a positive reading identity. We know that students reported then having a better self-perception and value of reading. And this study, the results of this study, correlated with the results of these previous studies. The contrast is found when it comes to the comprehension. And so in Hall's study, you can see she found that there was a significant increase of the students who scored on or above grade level on post-assessments when measured by the comprehension, and that was not necessarily found with this particular study. The implications, you can see participants were positively impacted because they were given time to really focus on their metacognition. They weren't just being drilled with skills and strategy, application, and development. The researcher really sat down and had them think through their identity as readers, the history of where that might come from, and start to kind of put pieces together in order for them to feel more efficacious throughout the study. And they have these skills going into next year. And so being able to think back on developing that identity and feeling good about where they were at the end of the study is really important. Teachers were also positively impacted as they could be given permission to not focus directly on the strategy development, but just also thinking about the student behind those numbers. Limitations, the small sample size was a limitation. I wonder how the trend for data might be on more of an upward or a statistically significant trend had the sample size been a bit larger than just the 4. Time and timing. This particular study was an intervention, and so it met 3 out of the 5 days of the week, just for 30 to 40 minutes each time. That limited the amount of time that the researcher had one-on-one individually with the students to have those planning and reflecting conversations. Sometimes those were really rushed. The timing also is a factor. We need more support from Tier 1 because this intervention started partway through the semester. There wasn't that continuity between Tier 1 and Tier 2, and the Tier 1 teacher really sets the tone. And possibly more authentic reading tasks as opposed to measuring just by a standardized assessment. Suggestions for future research are listed here. Again, increasing the sample size, maybe making a year-long study, maybe even exploring other options other than goal setting. Overall, it was a really positive experience, and you can see my references here. And thank you.